Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street continues to partner with organisations across Australia and the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise in their own communities. And in 2020, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope and build communities from the ground up. So if you want to find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on this week's episode, we're joined by Molly Willmott, who is the National Union of Students President. And as a former student hack myself, I cannot believe in all the years I've been doing political podcasts that I've never, ever interviewed the president of NUS. And today I'm going to, and I'm really excited by it. And I sort of put out the call to a whole bunch of former student politics hacks and said, I'm interviewing an NUS president today. Give me your questions. So we're going to have a bit of a chat towards the end about some more of the trivial, banal, inside the beltway kind of conversations about student politics and NUS conference and stuff. But at the start, it's going to be a bit more about sort of policy and get to know about Molly a little bit better as well. So looking forward to today's episode. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, please give us a rating and leave us a review. And for all the updates, follow us on Dunn Street on our socials, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And obviously, there's a lot going on over in the United States at the moment. With all the protests across all the towns and cities in all 50 states of the United States. And I'm sure we're all looking on in sort of disbelief and horror and helplessness and all the other different sort of feelings that progressives and centre-left people would feel about this. If you do want to do something, it's not necessarily easy for people outside, so non-US residents, to donate to organisations in the United States, particularly the ones that are PACs, because of their campaign finance laws. However, and I'm going to put this up on the Instagram account and on Facebook, on the Dunn Street Instagram and Dunn Street Facebook account later today. We're taping this one on Friday, with links to donate to an organisation called Colour of Change. I think they are the largest online racial justice organisation in the United States. I personally have had dealings with some of the people that work at Colour of Change throughout the years. Some of the guys in their former jobs when they worked for the sort of former Obama organisers and whatnot have come out to Australia and worked with some of our organisers in developing their skills. And obviously we've sort of maintained those connections with some of those great people who now are working for Colour of Change. The Dunn Street US engagement mission spent an afternoon at Colour of Change at the DC offices, and we did some training on organising and leadership development with their field team. Really inspiring people, a really great organisation, and Australian citizens can donate to Colour of Change. I think their website is colourofchange.org, and their main donation page there's other pages you can donate to, but their main donation page will take donations from Australia. So I encourage you to do that. The money raised from that goes to, in particular, speaking to some of the guys during the week, they're focusing on their campaigns for the upcoming presidential election campaign, but in particular the down ballot races in electing what they call champion prosecutors. So prosecutors that are actually going to make real change in prosecuting police when they are basically bad cops, racist cops. It's one of the key areas that Colour of Change are focusing on, as well as obviously seeking justice for Floyd and for Bree and for so many other African American men and women that have been the victim of police brutality. So if you do want to help, that's one way you can do that, is obviously make a donation to Colour of Change. Also, if you want to do some things on the home front as well, we're also going to put up some posts about some Aboriginal, Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander organisations that definitely need your support in both either your feet, your voice, or your funds. So we're going to post some links on our Instagram and our Facebook page later today as well. Okay, so here's some good things that you can do. If you can't physically get over there because we can't jump on planes, you can send your money, and certainly you can do more at home to support our Indigenous brothers and sisters. So we'll put some links for you to there. But let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Friday afternoon on a glorious winter's day in Melbourne, and joining me on the line is the president of the National Union of Students, Molly Willmott. Molly, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
Look, I don't know exactly who listens to this podcast. I do know that about 20% of my audience, bizarrely enough, is from overseas, but I would hazard a guess that at least 50% of those that aren't from overseas, that are based in Australia, are ex-student politics hacks from the 1990s onwards. And I think that they'll be listening in more from a nostalgia perspective about their days in student politics to this particular episode, given your position within NUS. So they're probably going to live vicariously through what you're up to at the moment in this podcast. So there's a bit of pressure on me to make sure that I ask the right questions for you a bit in terms of your work in the student political movement at the moment. So a nation turns its lonely eyes to you, Molly. Are you ready for this?
Look, I'm fine. My entire year has been living through the nostalgia of previous hacks, so I'm very well versed with it. I'm all good with it.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. I think one of the strengths of the student movement, certainly amongst particularly probably national office bearers, but even people who have had leadership positions within the student movement, is that they're very good at passing down the history of our movement throughout the generations. So it's good to hear that tradition is continuing on.
Yeah. No, it's fine. I love the stories. So
right,
it's my job.
Well, I'll flag then that I apologise from the outset that if I frame any of my questions with the back in my day, which I am going to do, unfortunately, but I'll try to limit it to only about 30 questions. But let's dive in. Tell us a bit about yourself. How did you first get involved in student activism?
Yes, so I'm in my 5th year, which is a lot longer than it's supposed to be, of a arts politics degree at Melbourne Uni. I wasn't like going onto campus being like, well, I'm going to go become a student politician. I'm going to go be involved in politics. In year 12, my high school history teacher was teaching us the Russian Revolution. And I was like, wow, that's like I don't completely vibe with everything that Lenin did in the revolution in Russia. But she took the time to explain like left-wing politics and activism and grassroots movement growing. She's this like little Geordie woman who I was obsessed with. And I walked on the campus being like, I want to go change the world. I want to go do something. And I sort of fell into the student union of Melbourne, and things like women's activism was where it really started. I used to be I started really at UMSU, which is the student union there, as a women's officer, and was president last year, and now I'm the NUS president. And like throughout that time, I realised that it's not just, it's not just like I want to become a women's activist. I sort of realised how important education accessibility is for everyone, and I think that's really what's hit me about my politics is how important I think education is, and how things like Centrelink access, which is a lot of work that we do as well, how things like, accessibility for people of colour, for disabled students is so important to our society of like building a better future. So it's sort of been a growth thing over the past few years of like, I came into this very broad, like I'm going to save the world. And now I've come into the education space, and I couldn't be happier. So that's where I'm at right now. That's how I really got involved. Sometimes it feels like I've sort of fell into this, but it's fun.
I want to pick up on that sentence there, because you said that twice now. You said you fell into the student union at Melbourne University. How does one fall into it? Like, what were those initial first steps? What was that moment where you decided that you wanted to go and most likely probably talk to a stranger and say, hey, how do I get involved in something?
So when I started uni, it was off the back. It was a couple of years removed from the deregulation protests in 2014, which were the biggest student movement actions probably since the introduction of HEX or the Iraq War. So we're coming off a lot of momentum as a movement, and I was seeing, actions on campus. I was seeing students who are going out and just talking to other students about what was important to them. And I just, you make a friend who makes a friend, and they were like, hey, come to this women's collective, come to this education collective, come talk about this issue. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'll come along. And it was sort of I didn't really know what was going on for a while, but I knew that, UMSU and student unionism was important. I come from a union family. I come from a family who believes in collectivism. And when sort of those ideals of student unionism is the first step young people take towards active collectivism, I was like, okay, this is it. This is what I meant. It's hard to explain how you fall into something like this, but it was sort of just little steps along the way, going to more events, sort of getting a better idea. I also all cards on the table, a huge hack. So it was I walked in, and it was people were saying acronyms and things like NUS or things like DREG, and it would just be me Googling the history of the student union for hours and hours, just seeing huge things that we've done in the past. And I was like, oh, that's actually really cool. I sort of don't want to leave now.
You mentioned at the start there that you're finding it all a bit confusing at the start. When did the penny kind of drop for you, where things started to make a little bit more sense?
I think it was getting involved in NUS. I think it was getting involved in the national movement. I think, coming from Melbourne Uni, we come from a very privileged position. My background itself isn't necessarily privileged. It's a single income family. It's inherently confusing to go onto a campus where your colleagues and your classmates are incredibly affluent or privileged to be able to be there. But I think it started making more sense when I got involved in the national, because I saw that it wasn't just my campus, that it wasn't just my friends, that it wasn't just around that time, the big campaigns that were running were against sexual assault on campus, which is an issue that unfortunately is still incredibly prevalent. It was the government was moving towards backdoor cuts to education or cuts to art schools. And when I saw that this is something that a random person in Wollongong was really passionate about it as well, I was like, oh, okay, so this is it. This is what this is. Of course, it took me 3 or 4 years to fully get all the acronyms and to get sort of the politicking of it. But, yeah, as soon as I got involved in that, it made sense.
You obviously put your hand up and were successful in the election to the role as president of the National Union of Students. What first motivated you to want to put your hand up for that position?
It's so halfway through my term at UMSU last year as president. Also, the previous president before me ended up tenured as president as well. So I was working really closely with her about what she was up to. But halfway through last year, I sort of had this nagging budge that I hadn't done enough, or that I'd been really involved last year with some national stuff, but it was the government has successively cut education for so long that I didn't feel like I could leave student politics happy or fulfilled if I hadn't started organising on a national level, especially against the federal government. Because when you're on a campus, you're caught up with a lot of the vice chancellor's doing this, we have to do this for students. And I wanted to go more into the pure activism and advocacy, because I sort of, what a lot of people in the student movement, which is an issue in NUS, and I'm not here to think that NUS is a perfect body, but a lot of students don't understand the connection that federal policy makes to the contribution that makes to their campuses and to their students. So when we had students come to our advocacy service last year being I have no Centrelink, I can't access, I have to drop out of uni because of that, it was sort of those nagging little things. It was well, I want to go on a national level and try and fix this. So yeah, that's sort of where that's at. Don't regret it yet, which is nice. Despite COVID, but yeah.
My experience in the times I've never ran as a national office bearer, but certainly helped a lot of colleagues of my generation get elected, and the nerve-wracking week of national conference when you are a candidate seeking national office can take a toll on people mentally, I think. Was it an easy process for you to get elected, or did you find that week quite nerve-wracking? And, knowing full well, because you're not a part of the negotiations on behalf of your group, and so you're kind of left in the dark for most of the week until someone comes and says, okay, we just use a cliche, we have the numbers now.
Yeah, look, it wasn't the easiest. I think the fact that, one of my best mates and was like the previous president at UMSU and now the previous president at NUS, it sort of gave me a lot of comfort of she was coming up to me and being like, it's fine if you feel like this. It's like very stressful. I think the main thing about NatCon and when I got elected is I really love a yell. I really love debate. I love speaking on, because like for those listening, national conference is a mix between 5 days or 4 days of yelling and policy debate on really niche issues. Some, like most of the time, very important education platforms. And I sort of took all that stress and fueled it into the lectern, to be honest. Had some great yells. Yeah, look, it's not an easy time. I'm quite excited about this year. Not really. Like, we have to organise the conference. I think it's going to be a very different perspective. But yeah, it's mine now.
Well, I'm going to ask you about some challenges that you're going to face in 2020 because of all the years that you've been to be elected president of the National Union. 2020 certainly has presented some challenges for you guys. But before we do that, just set the scene for me now. Try and bring me up to speed to what's sort of the state of student organisations and associations in 2020, because my entry into student politics was around the VSU, or another acronym, Voluntary Student Unionism debate here in Victoria, and then eventually expanded at a national level with the election of the Howard government. Fast forward 21, 22 years later since that campaign and that debate, financially, what is the shape of student unions today? Where do they derive most of their income to support the work that they do?
Yeah, so I think I speak for most student activists, if not all of us, when I say that the introduction of voluntary student unionism, which took away sort of the obligation to pay student unions fees, was one of, like, it gutted us. It absolutely gutted us. We had a bunch of student unions fall. We had student unions amalgamate. We had you look at student unions, especially around your time in uni, we were not only like doing the protests, we were running concerts, we were running clubs, we were running like the shop fronts at uni, we were getting our income from there. And the loss of membership gutted us so completely that we had to sell all our assets off. Student unions fell, and it's still sort of a thorn in our side to how we work. About 7 years ago, the Gillard government, I believe, introduced the student services and amenities fee, which was like a compulsory fee that students would pay to the university, and a negotiated amount will go to your student union. So the issue with that is, and this is where student unions are right now, is that you have student unions who have negotiated a really good deal, because that's most of our income. If you didn't keep your shop fronts, if you didn't keep your independent income, and then you have student unions who get 1.5% of that entire payment, and the rest is being spent on the university for university projects, or it goes to sport. There are a bunch of campuses in the country where like the sporting programs and their gyms make 10 times more than the student union. And I think, when you're looking at what the state of the student movement is right now, is it is because of that hit with VSU and how restricted our funding is. There's also rules about what we can do. It's really not like there's a lot of issues where it's like sometimes student unions don't think they can go as militant crazy as they probably should and could be doing, because our is tied to it. Like, we can't really go storm the Vice Chancellor's office, because you could very well go, no money for you, and then be closed, which has taken away a lot of the stories from the 70s, 80s and 90s for the student movement, which is really unfortunate. And it's something that we're like, COVID threw a spanner in the works, but it was something that we were going to be working on this year, is sort of going to like state and federal governments and being like, student unionism is important for these reasons. Can you give us like a mandatory minimum of the SAF payment so we can at least have a bit of flexibility to do our job? Because there's not really any other union, like, and this is like, if you look at the wider movement, there's no other union that is so financially tied to the people they're fighting against, which is really unfortunate. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it just takes away that leverage that you can have to a certain degree anyway. And the original debate for us always was student control, student affairs, and when you have to go cap in hand to an organisation or to the Vice-Chancellor's office to get that funding, that certainly does make it a lot harder. In terms of membership recruitment then, because that was what our big concern was back in the 90s, was that if they brought in voluntary student unionism, then it would be up to the student associations to recruit members to join their student association, which at the time I kind of thought, well, okay, I'd much rather compulsory unionism, but I recognise, and also I was about to go and work for a trade union, so I knew that the world out there wasn't based on compulsory conscription, and people had to make an argument to people about why they should pay their own hard-earned dollars into an association. So if that was the life that we had to leave, then we needed to get smart about that. Is that not the case anymore? Students or organisations don't need to actually get people to sign up to an organisation?
It depends on the campus. There's a lot of places where, because their SAF payment is so low, they have to charge a membership when there's a lot of recruiting. There are, universities that do like, it's sort of equivalent to like the union shopper of like you get rewards or you get something if you join your union. But yeah, union membership on student unions, depending on what they're doing, it can also be quite low. So you look at, your less active student unions and their campus memberships like 1,000 or 2,000 for a campus of 10, which is still pretty good actually. But it's sort of like it's that never-ending struggle of like, how do we get more people into the union? How do we get more people involved? Credit to the campuses that do have to do that. Look, I've been pretty lucky in that we still have all our services open towards like non-members, and a lot of unions do, just as a form of recruitment in itself, but also we can't close our doors on students who need it.
So turning to contemporary politics or student politics and the broader student movement, I'm just interested in getting a sense from you about what are the signature campaigns that is defining the work of the National Union students and the broader student movement right now, notwithstanding obviously the challenges that coronavirus has presented to you, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But what were you guys up to before our lives altered dramatically?
Yeah, so I think what we were up to before coronavirus has sort of been brought to the light a bit in the public domain a bit by coronavirus and the state of education right now is what we were looking at was the corporatisation of universities. And when you look at successive decades of government cuts, we have the lowest funding of universities based on GDP in the developed world. We're having huge restructures. We're having universities go online. We're having universities close down. That the state of universities has moved so far away from what it should be, which is, academic, like I'm going to go change, or like not even going to go change the world. I'm going to go learn about the world. I'm going to go learn about, social movements and social ideas. And it's become a very transactional sort of process on campuses. So what we were doing was we were going to work with a bunch of other peak student bodies, like the graduate students and the international students and the NTU as well, about how we would change the higher education sector to be more compassionate, to be more empathetic, to be less transactional and less corporate, which in itself, because of how higher ed's going, is still happening, but in a very different lens. Other than that, I think you can't really look at youth movements, really look at students without talking about the climate movement. So we were doing a bit of work last year, and we did want to continue this year of working with, the school strikers who are now entering into uni to, help with the movement towards combating climate change. Because I think that's my favourite thing about the student movement. It's not just on campus issues. It's not just, what's happening on an education level. It's a sort of an obligation for us to be speaking about social change. I mean, it was a student movement that pushed the fight against conscription. It was a student movement that, has been at every single anti-war protest. or, just we've led the way for Indigenous rights or helped lead the way for that as well. So that's sort of where we were at. There was a couple other things like floating around of like, this is also quite a big year for queer students with the Religious Exemptions Act, and we're sort of seeing where we would fit together all these different things, as well as, the rates of New Start and youth allowance, poverty levels, and then, X, Y, Z, and then Corona hit in March. So we had to do a pause on a lot of that stuff, but, we're preparing to go back to it, or at least modify it with the post-Corona world. Since we're at.
What did... We've all had to adapt in various ways because of the restrictions that were placed on how we all move and interact with each other. Has there been any innovation that's come out of the student movement in that period since March that will change the way you organise or change the way that you interact with each other? Like, obviously you couldn't go out and visit campuses, and I think it will be a while before you can actually get out to a campus. So you are the head of a national organisation. You need to communicate with people. How have you guys adapted?
Yeah, look, I think that's been the difficult thing of this year isn't what I expected to walk into. I expected to be going around the country and talking to students very directly, and I got to do a couple of weeks of that, which was nice. But the way that we've adapted to it is, besides becoming very good at video conferencing, we've looked at the way that we organise online. It's things like, the student movement right now is so reliant on communications. It's so reliant on, what we're sending out, what we're putting out, how we're doing it, that, like, I have absolute so much pride in so many unions who have been able to adapt to that. So it's like, how do you escalate a petition? How do you escalate like a change.org? How do you push that into organising? And I think that's where you see these beautiful things of like the cavalcades that are driving around campuses to fight for education quality, or you see, online rallies are a big thing right now, and how we properly engaging people and doing calls to action, how we're using social media streams. So I think when we're back into being able to go out to rallies, when we're back being able to like actually go and meet and have those conversations, I think we're going to be a lot more well-versed on online organising, which is, I think some people should be scared because I've seen some excellent graphics come out of this year. So it's only going to get better. But yeah, other than that, it's like, if you go outside of the activism, we have campuses who are now live streaming events, who are now doing like food hampers, who are now doing those like real face-to-face advocacy work online or throughout other socials. So it's sort of, I think it's given us a lot more flexibility in how we can do things.
You made a really interesting point before, which I want to pick up on now. That is that the student strike protests, all the primary and high school students are now at the university age. That's incredible. And I think that people who aren't even engaged in mainstream politics would have recognised that there are a lot of younger people who are not even of the voting age that were very active and motivated around this particular issue. And consistently so as well, which wasn't just some sort of one-off fad. I think the ability to maintain and sustain their efforts has been quite remarkable. They're about to come into university. How do you seek to embrace the successes that they've had with the work that you do? And I asked that question, and I want to have a follow-up in a moment, which is about the relevancy of student organisations in the face of the mainstream broad student population. I'll ask you in a moment about the challenges with that. But let's talk first about these young kids coming through. How are you going to work with these guys?
Look, I think the best thing about these young kids coming in is they're already incredibly angry. A lot of, and we'll talk about in a second, a lot of the issue is apathy when you walk into a campus. My parents voted Liberal, my parents voted Labor, that's politics. Don't really want to get involved in anything else. I just want to finish my degree. So I think the way that we've been able to engage with them is obviously campuses are doing a lot about climate change and the climate movement. It is very pertinent on campuses as well. Some of our campuses are huge investors or get huge donations from the big banks who invest into fossil fuels, who, like, we have Rio Tinto coming to clubs days, or careers days. So I think there's a lot of action on the climate movement that can be done on a campus level. But look, if you're angry about one thing, then you're more than likely angry about a broader systemic issue of the way the world is. So it's a lot of sitting down and having those conversations of like, so if you're angry about climate change, you're angry about this, like, shouldn't we have just a more sustainable education system to be able to like learn about renewables or like sort of have those conversations? And that's been a lot of what these kids coming in have been doing. But also these kids are looking for it when they walk in. What we noticed at the start of the year was these kids have come onto campus and they're looking for the student union environment department. They're looking for the student union education department, which is, I've never seen it before. I've never really heard of it before, besides a little bit in 2014 with DREG. So I think it was quite good. I'm excited to see these kids who are now, the main organisers are entering into uni in the next few years. So I'm excited to see what they do.
One of the challenges that we had, I'm sure this has been the case, I think it was in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s as well, an internal debate within the movement, and sometimes it defined, I guess, the factional groupings within the student population, was that you spoke before about apathy amongst the student population. And that the apathy somewhat undermined our arguments when we went in to lobby and lobby politicians in Canberra, particularly around the VSU debate, because they were saying that you are not representative of the student body. And look, we never solved that problem. On most campuses, I think, it varied from campus to campus, but I can only speak about my old campus, La Trobe Uni. I think 10 to 15% of the student population voted in student elections. And in terms of the participation in the kind of things that we were doing, it was quite minimal as well. We found it difficult to reach out to students who are basically just there because they want to get their degree and they've got competing interests. They might have 3 part-time jobs to try and help pay for their university degree, and they may be apathetic, or we might call it apathy, but they may just see there's no sense of urgency that we're presenting to them. What have you found in your time in student politics that where you've had success? You can point to successes where you may have started to break into that part of the student body where people are going, oh yeah, that's something I can get around.
Yeah, my time in student politics has been a bit hit and miss in terms of getting that wider student engagement. I think, going to the lobbying efforts, the most jarring moment of my time in student politics. So I walked into this meeting with the University of Melbourne and I was like, I have 15 recommendations about how you can combat sexual violence because you're not doing anything. These are we got advocates, we got people in the sector to go and fight this. And after some discussion, the response was, but only 900 people voted for you, so why should we listen to you? And I just cared about this so much, and I got so angry that it sort of lit this fire in me that I think probably has led me to the position I'm in now. But I think the successes that I've had, and I've got 2 to link back to, is following that meeting with the university, I just sort of went, F yeah, I'm calling a rally. And I got a rally together for an anniversary of a survey that came out on the issue, and we got 400 students out, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's pretty good for just before exams, especially with the current student body. We were able to get colleges out. We were able to get a lot of support from the student body, and it sort of scared the university, and they sat down with us a week later and were like, okay, so we've considered some of the stuff that you brought to us. So that was great, and it was sort of like when you can – I think it's all about, again, communication, of how you're communicating those issues and why they're important. How are you I think it goes into, some of the principles of politics and lobbying on a bigger level have to be brought into student unions of who your networks. We built really good networks. We built that really well. The second one is, and the second aspect of it is campaigning on issues that really affect students. I think there's an issue with student unionism of it's a lot of our wins come from reactive things. It's really hard to make proactive change in the student movement.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is?
I think it goes down to the ideological argument on things of are we selling the ideological argument? You were saying before that it's how do you combat apathy? but it's like, are we actually going into the student body and being like, here is why student representation is important? Like when we're being slammed online by liberals who don't necessarily like us, are we fighting them and being like, no, this is what's important? Like, I think someone once told me that, like, before I started as president of UMSU, I was like, they were like, look, they don't have to like you, but there can be no excuse they don't know what you're doing and they don't know that you exist. So it's about, you know, talking to students about that we actually exist and like having, you know, linking things like, you know, if 1,000 students are going to your barbecues every week, do they know who's running the barbecues? And stuff like that. And because we haven't been doing that well, the making proactive change has been really difficult. It's also like a lot of the proactive change that the student movement wants to do is very like big brain. Like it's like, well, we want to change the entire way this thing is looked at. And it takes a lot of effort and a lot of like building support, a lot of like, it would take generations of a student politician to make a change that they thought was very like important. But when you're looking at reactive change, if it's something that's impacting students now and impacting the actual personal of the student, I think it goes into individualism as well. Of like my biggest success, I think, in student politics was like last year, my university put through special consideration changes, like really awful special consideration changes that would have meant that students would have dropped out of university because they couldn't sit their exams. And we were able, because that was affecting so many students individually, we got 3,000 survey responses in 2 days. We were able to like mount this huge campaign, that like huge public campaign, and now a huge amount of the student body knows who we are because of that.
That's huge.
I was walking around campus. I was in an Uber once and they turned around and was like, you're the UMSU president, you did the special consideration thing. And I was like, yeah, that was me. Thank you. I think that's the issue, is the proactive reactive. And when you touch those issues that students really care about, like deeply, then you sort of hit that apathy a little bit. But I think, yeah, that's a concerning thing about student politics is, and NUS itself, is that you have years where you're doing the reactive changes, where you're fighting against HEX, when you're fighting against BSU, when you're fighting against speed deregulation, or in my case, coronavirus, where you're able to just get this groundswell of support, and then you don't keep the momentum up, and then it's 3 years of you're doing the work, but it's not as public as you'd like it.
Interesting you said that we talk about fighting against HEX. That was always one of the bigger sort of issues that really divided the student movement, was the position on HEX.
It still is.
And I'll put my hat in the ring and say, obviously I was from the student unity generation of activists. What's the debate on HEX right now? Like, where is it? Originally it was, you're either for it or you're against it. Is it moved to more nuanced about in terms of how much it is, or is it still a kind of a free education versus a sort of a HEX model where we expand the finance pool to make sure that more people can go to uni? What's the story? Where are we with that now?
Look, if you love the performance of student politics and the fighting, it's still very much a free ed versus HEX debate, because it's, you know, every year we have an education conference in the middle of the year. Socialist Alternative, who are Trotskyists, will run a free education is best. Student Unity, who are Labour right, will run a HEX is best, and it'll just cause hours of fighting. But I think that a lot of more nuance has sort of been brought into the discussion, and I've heard a lot of really good takes from either side in the past few years about it. And I think, look, the HEX system right now is it's not what was introduced in the 90s. It is like, if you're a manager at McDonald's, you are just under by about $1,000 the HEX threshold now. When, HEX was introduced to, target people under $80,000 a year, you've got a good job, thanks to uni, here you can pay your degree back. But when you have, frontline emergency room nurses who aren't being paid very much, having to pay back their HEX, having to support their families, like single parents, then that's not working. There's also HEX caps of you can't go and study more than $100,000 of a degree now, which is, if you're doing, if you're like my mum, who wants to go back and study like as much as possible and get as much different degrees, then you're sort of limited in what you can do. So a lot of the discussion on HEX is now turns towards how bad is HEX, but how do we fix that? And that's where the divergence between free ed and HEX sort of becomes a bit money, because I've got people who believe in HEX who are saying to me that NUS should be fighting for free education, because that sort of moves the political window towards a better HEX system. And when, like, you know, if we go to the furthest left option, the compromise is better HEX. So it's been really interesting. I'm actually, one of the reasons I'm excited for our national conference at the end of the year is the free education discussion, because, you know, it's been the first year in a while that I haven't just heard the free education is middle class welfare, and then you know, HEX is bad because it limits students' access to unis. So it's interesting. I'm excited.
The JobKeeper stuff that's come out of the announcements by the federal government to help sort of protect or assist people whilst the economy is in absolute freefall. Where's NUS on this? What have you guys? What have you guys said? What's your views on? Because obviously casuals who have worked for less than 12 months aren't eligible. International students aren't eligible. This is going to impact on a lot of your members.
Yeah, so we, in terms of actual campaigning, we're taking a lot of the movement from the union movement as well. There's no point us running a campaign as a sole silo. Like, we're unionists. We're going to support what, you know, Vic Trades Hall or the ACTU is doing in their actions. But yeah, you're right. There are 580 on last estimates international students who are still in Australia who haven't had access to any of the government schemes, including JobKeeper. And then you have casuals who are working for less than 12 months. And that's a huge amount of the people that we represent. So we have been trying to, you know, obviously get that moved. It's not looking like it's shifting very much because the government, I don't think, really cares. Yeah, I think another thing about JobKeeper that was sort of, it's been pushed a lot in the sector, and I'm not really sure how wide else it's gone, is they exempted universities from it, and they exempted and they, you know, changed the JobKeeper package to ensure that universities were not covered by this when we have a highly casualised workforce. When we are losing money because we're losing international students, which is universities' sort of foundational income besides public funding. And it's sort of, the JobKeeper package has put universities into this downward spiral of, because they can't access it for their tutors. We have campuses like La Trobe who are, you know, there are news stories coming out that they're broke, that, you know, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of staff who are about to be let off because of the JobKeeper package. So I think that's also, we're taking sort of a different lens with JobKeeper as well with that. But yeah.
I didn't know that. That's... That one slipped by me. There you go. That's amazing. I didn't realise there was an exemption for universities. It's insane.
Yeah. It's meant that, sorry, no, you go.
I was actually going to sort of just change tack now and just ask some questions a bit more broader about the union, where it's heading. One of the things that I thought we struggled with on, particularly at NUS conference, when we were debating about resources of the union and where we spent them, which required us to sort of ask questions of ourselves, like, what type of organisation are we, or do we wish to be? Are we an advocacy organisation? Are we simply an awareness-raising organisation? Are we an activist organisation? What's the future for NUS? How does it? And you know, you and your general secretary are in charge of the funds. Where are you putting your resources to win these campaigns?
Yeah, I think where we're heading towards is, there's been an issue with NUS, I think, since it was created, of, you go to national conference, you have a set of policies, office bearers could pick what they want to do out of that, and then the next year runs around and it happens all again, and there's no continuity of campaigns. And I think, you know, we've had financial issues for quite a while because of VSU, because when our members lose funding, we lose funding. So what I would really like to move towards is a more strategic, long-lasting campaign. And we've had it in, you know, small shots of the Safety on Campus campaign, which the Women's Department has been running. That's where a lot of people see our value, or did see our value, is that campaign did so much. Now with the changes to Centrelink and New Start, Youth Allowance, and the real push to raise those to at least the poverty line, you're seeing these long-lasting campaigns actually do a bit of action. So I think I think that's where I want to move towards is we're advocacy, we're activist, we're all of that, but we need to have that continuity because that's been the biggest issue. It's, you know, in a job where I'm only here for a year, it's really hard to have that continuity, but I think how we shape that's really important. And I think a lot of the future for us should be around membership and our members and looking at like how the actual values of the union movement and how we like give out support is really important as well. Of like we have campuses who need us, who need the resources that we have to help them do their job. So I think the next few years we really have to move towards like showing our members that we're not just this hack body that you give money to, that we're actually going to go and support you in your hardest times. We want to, you know, go and connect with other campuses as well. It's a bit of a difficult question because I think everything's sort of been thrown up in the air in the past few months. But I think I think going towards that direction and showing people the value of us and for a few years as well should outweigh the negatives.
The restrictions that have been, I know that it's slowly being eased across the states and territories at varying degrees. How are you going to hold your elections, your student elections, in the second half of the year, given that the first elections, from my memory anyway, used to start in August and take you right through to October? What's your contingency plans with that?
That's a discussion that we're going to have probably when we get a better idea of what campuses are doing. So our delegates for our national conference are elected at those elections. And look, I think we should probably keep a pretty hands-off approach and let campuses do what they need to do with those. And then I think we'll have a discussion probably towards the end of the year about what the contingency plan is. From my understanding, there's not a huge amount of upheaval. Like there hasn't been any elections fully cancelled. Students on campuses will still get the right to vote for their representatives at some point. I think it's just the thing with Corona is that you think it's going one way, or you think, you know, a policy decision or a response is going one way and then it completely goes the other. So I don't think we want to make any concrete plans before we get the final, this is what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, tough question and always a tough answer as well. It was something that jogged my mind as I was preparing the questions this week. I thought, shit, you got elections coming up. How are you going to do that? But I'm sure you'll work out ways to get around the challenges that have been presented to you by Corona. I want to turn our attention just to discuss what's happening over in the United States. So obviously we're watching the events unfold there at the moment. And aside from feeling somewhat helpless to support folks over in the US, we all may be sort of going through our own internal reflections about both as individuals and as citizens of this nation of ours and what we've done in the fight against racial injustice. What are the conversations being had right now inside the student movement?
I think it's every meeting I've started this week has been like, so we did an acknowledgement of country, and then after the acknowledgement of country, it was like, well, we have to understand also the context of in which we're in right now of like these protests in America. You know, we can't really look at America and turn our back on what's happening in our own country. And I think a lot of the discussion is, you know, absolute solidarity. I don't think there's anyone who doesn't support these protests and who isn't, because I think I actually saw something really interesting about the protests and young people, the Zoomers, is that we don't get our news and we don't get the way that we interact with things like what's happening in Minnesota and around the country from Channel 9 or Channel 7. We get it from people on the front lines of the protests, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. So we're getting a very like raw, unfiltered, this is what's happening. So I think there's a huge amount of like solidarity with the people in the US. But a lot of the conversation, if not all of the conversation, is flipped to Australia and what we're doing about racial injustice here. And I think it's given a lot of people some time to think about how we're engaging with Indigenous people, how we're engaging with Indigenous students. I think it shows a lot that 4 days after this protest started, that kid had his face slammed into the pavement in Sydney. And that's sort of where we're moving towards is like it's not enough to show up to the rallies on January 26th. It's not enough to share like a little bit of stuff about Indigenous Australians is like how we actively engaging with these groups. How like reconciliation, like how are we actually changing the structures of our union to be more open to Indigenous Australians? Because the fight for racial justice here is just as, I think, on the back foot as in other places as well. So look, we're running a couple of rallies over the weekend in regional centres regarding it, Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Australians. But I think that's something that I think is going to, I think this should, and I think the student movement does want this to be a trigger for how we look at Australian deaths in custody and police brutality.
The makeup of the student leadership in the 1990s was very white and very middle class. In fact, I think if you moved further to the left on the political spectrum amongst my comrades in the student movement, the more left you were, probably the more wealthier you were. I think half the Trots, their parents worked for BHP and Rio Tinto. But and certainly notwithstanding the great commitment and activism from our international students to the movement, but by and large, the leadership was white and middle class. What's the demographics now like of people who are getting involved in student activism and taking on leadership roles? Does it truly reflect the student population?
Look, I don't think so. I think this is it should be the shame of the student movement is that we have people of colour there's a really high burnout rate of people of colour, especially in student of colour activism, which means that there's not a huge amount of those people going to leadership positions. Like we've gone from last year, the president and general secretary at NUS were both people of colour. This year, we're both white. And I think it's pretty overwhelming when you're going to a national conference about it. I think what we need, what we should be doing, and why it's important to have years where, and why we should be pushing for years where there are more people of colour in leadership, is that when you look at a group who you look up to, and when you look at a group of leaders in the student movement, and you don't see yourself, if you don't see someone who has struggled in the same ways as you, then you're probably going to turn away from that and be like, well, I actually don't really want to do this anymore. I think we've gotten better at engaging people of colour, but I think, and that a lot of that is like the engagement of international students into activism, but also the creation of like people of colour and ethnocultural departments within student unions. But I think it's really something that we haven't worked on very well. And I think it's going to take, how we're going to change it is it's going to take white people within the student movement to like reach their hand out to people of colour, being like, I'm going to upskill you in this really niche student politics thing, like negotiations of like, here's how you do something. Because normally when we're looking at the person who we upskill for that factionally or within the student movement, it's mostly like just a white person to do that. So I think it's just understanding and sort of forcing the upskill a little bit is how we would help. And also like combating our own racism. Like I think a lot of student activists, because we go in being like we're anti-racist, we're anti-homo, like we're not homophobic. There are a lot of things that we do that we don't realise are racist, or at least a microaggression for racism. And if we're not willing to go like, okay, what I just said was really problematic and I'm very sorry and I want to learn from this, if you're too scared to say, oh, I have an issue with this, then you're not going to be able to fix it, and people of colour are just going to turn away. So it's going to be a lot of work.
It's a long journey.
Yeah.
We're at 51 minutes, and I would get an absolute barrage of abusive messages from all of my student hack friends. I now didn't move to the insider questions of student politics. So if you weren't involved in student politics, you probably find the rest of this quite boring. But to begin, list me all the factions that are now existing in student politics that would be represented on the floor of the national conference, just so I need to get an update here. I need to understand who's who in the zoo these days. You don't need to give me numbers on floor and that kind of stuff. Although if you want to, you're more than welcome to. But I just need to know who's who in the zoo these days. Who's around?
So you have your consistent three. which is Social Alternative, who are our favourite Trotskyists, they're still around. Then you have National Labor Students, which is the Labor Left, who I'm a part of National Labor Students. It's very public. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. And then we have Student Unity, which is the Labor Right. Okay. And then...
So I'm just going to pause you there. Sorry, Molly, I'm just going to pause you for a second just to give people an update on that. So the National Labor Students, NLS, right? So you've gone through a couple of name changes because back in the early days you were Knowles. So it's just good for some of the Knowles people to remember that's the old Knowles crew, right? Yeah.
So Knowles and ALS, which was there was a split within the left.
Was at that conference?
2 groups. We merged. Yep. I had someone sit down and tell me about that a couple of years ago, and I was like, oofed. They merged in 2006 to create National Labor Students, and we've been here ever since.
Right. Socialist Alternative, that used to be Left Alliance. Is that right? Because Socialist Alternative was not around. They were the Trots, but the Trots were called Left Alliance in our generation. So I'm assuming Social Alternative have gone through a name change as well by the sounds of it.
Yeah. From my understanding, it was the members of Socialist Alternative now were kicked out of an international socialist organisation and were barred for life or something, because if anyone's talked to them, you can see why. But because of that, they created the Social Alternative organisation and then sort of purged out the rest of the Trotskyists who weren't in SALT. They don't really exist anymore. There was a time where, we had many more factions on conference floor, but now it's sort of the big three, and then the fourth one is the National Independents, which are a faction of independents. Some of them are members of the Labor Party, some of them are just random students, have now merged with the Grassroots, which are more greensy anarchist groups, to make the Grassroots independents. So there's now those 4 groups.
So I wonder if the Grassroots were the old NAL, non-aligned left, which is the old Van Batten crew. Because the independents were around in our day as well, but they were mostly centred out of WA, SA and Deakin in Victoria.
That's where a lot
merged. That's bizarre.
Yeah, it's been... they only merged a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Okay. And anyone else?
No, just the Liberals. The Liberals show up and then leave. They're not an active part of conference floor. I think the first time in my time, I've only seen them active at NUS twice, 2017 and last year. But it depends on how they go on student unions. They don't think NUS should exist. They don't really see the worth in engaging with it. I know in the past the Liberals saw the worth of engaging in NUS, yelling at Labor hacks. But they're not really quite involved anymore. There are subgroups or their own contingents that come in, like the Australian Union of Jewish Students comes in and has a small contingent sometimes, or at least has a representative. But that's sort of the factional lay of the land.
Interesting. So the internal divide in the Liberal students, the Australian Liberal Students Federation, always was, between the Liberal students that thought that we're best staying involved in the student movement to try and quell some of the more radical ideas of student unionism, and then there was ones that wanted to tear the whole place down. So those were the ones that would vote with the Trots on stuff, because the Trots would put up the most incredibly insane pieces of policy at conference, and the Libs would vote for it. In fact, would make amendments to some of the policies and add extra zeros onto the budget just to completely, cripple the union. Whereas there was some other, more of the Melbourne Uni strand of Liberal students are a little bit more sensible. That's funny. That was my follow-up question after that was, in how badly behaved are the Liberal students at conference these days? But if they're not turning up, then they can't be badly behaved.
Look, when they do show up, they are quite badly behaved.
Are we talking cat food in the dryers of the halls of residence kind of badly behaved?
Okay, not that bad. But, look, I wouldn't even say that they're necessarily badly behaved. It's just, they'll come up and they'll say something really controversial, or they'll say something that they know will get under the skins of everyone, and then the entire conference floor just erupts. It's mostly socialist alternative with, the chance of racist, sexist, anti-queer Liberals are not welcome here, which bangs, start erupting into the room, and the Liberal on the lectern is just like, of course you would, you rabid dogs.
Yeah. Good.
So, when they do show up, they do have a bit of fun.
Okay, that leads me on to my next question. This is very good, though. You're getting me good segues here. Conference chants, is that still a thing? Obviously it is by the sounds of it. Who's got the best,
Yes.
who can bring it? Who's got the best A game when it comes to conference chants?
Look, I'm gonna do it. I think Student Unity, when I started, had some pretty excellent chants. The Hex is best. It was quite loud and took over the room. Right now, Student Unity is quoting videos on the internet. So I think that's really fallen down a bit. And I have a talk to Unity at conference about hey, let's bring back some good ones.
Good.
Salts are pretty good with them because they have the really aggressive political chanting. NLS sort of stays out of it a little bit of we'll chant when needed, but we don't want to shut down conference floor completely with a good chant. But yeah,
right.
I love a good conference chant.
Good. Second question then on conference swag, and in particular the various student groupings T-shirts. Is that still a thing?
Yes, that is still a thing, and that is my favourite thing about conference is seeing what little petty jab someone's going to put on their T-shirt this year.
Yes.
So yeah, NLS and Unity have we've consistently had our shirts. The Trots do not. They do not do shirts, which is unfortunate because I think they'd have some funny ones.
Yeah.
They could really, really do a good shirt. And then the grassroots have started doing their shirts, but I love the shirts. I love the fighting to decide what's going to be on the shirt. I love the if you do something really particular, the other factions finding you on the first day and ripping your hair apart and seeing the back of your shirt. It's the best part.
That's true. You reminded me, yes, the internal deliberations about what goes on the shirt in terms of the slogan under your faction's banner was intense, sometimes greater than who actually was going to become the candidate for various national office bearer positions.
Oh, some of the most vicious fights I've seen have been what's going to be on the shirt this year.
So what's going to be on the shirt this year? Because you have a lot of sway in this, I would assume.
I don't. It's up to the other members at NLS.
Do they get a vote?
They just yes. Everyone
Classic.
with us gets a vote. Look, we had a really good shirt last year, so we have to sort of either up the game a little bit or just completely move in a different direction. So it's going to be a lot of internal debate. I don't necessarily want to be a part of it because I just think that it would just get very spicy.
Yep. Business committee, is it still a thing?
BizCom is still a thing, but we have for you listeners who know what happens on business committee and the fighting, we have done a lot of work to stop the fighting. We have a 6'7" security guard named Tiny who does not let this shit happen anymore. Last year we did get a table broken, but that was an accident. So yeah, we don't do the fighting. We do still eat paper. That is the question I get the most from older hacks is, yes, we still eat that paper.
I just put it in my pocket.
Want being talked about.
Yes, I just put it in my pocket.
No, it got to the point where people were going into people's pockets to try and get that motion. It's you eat it or you burn it. But
that's
yeah.
I like that. That's taking it to a new level. That's very good.
Yeah.
Then speaking of motions coming to business committee, they are often delivered to that table by someone called a runner. So my question is, when you appoint a first-year delegate to be a runner on conference floor, do they react like they've just been given $1 million and it's the greatest responsibility in their life?
Yeah, I reckon for the first motion. Also, I feel really bad for your listeners who don't know what we're talking about right now. But
they stopped listening hours ago. Don't worry about it. We're fine. Keep going.
Look, they're welcome to come to a national conference if they please. But yes, for the first three motions, the runner is very, very excited. And then it gets to the point where the COG table is going, run this over to Student Unity right fucking now.
Yeah.
Sorry, part of my language.
You're okay.
And,
you can fucking swear. It's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Then, then the shine sort of wears off.
Fair
and
enough.
it just becomes whoever can walk.
Right, because then my flip question to that is, when you appoint a delegate that's attended several conferences and you ask them to be a runner on the floor, does it look like you've just shat in their mouth? Because they're saying, really?
Sorry, pardon?
I was going to say, if when you appoint a delegate that has attended several conferences and you ask them to be a runner, does the look on their face, does it appear like you've just defecated in their mouth because they're like, really? You're giving me this job?
Look, yeah, but where I'm at right now is where I'm at. My take is cop it.
Yeah,
and I think that's a lot of NatCon is like, yeah, the jobs suck, but look, being the runner is actually quite fun. You get to banter with the other factions' cog tables, and I think it gets to the point by like the Wednesday of conference where our appointed runner doesn't exist anymore, and you're just pointing at random people, being like, give this paper to Socialist Alternative now. So
it's a huge responsibility. I'll tell you right now, one of the best runners for Student Unity ever, absolutely efficient, was the now member in the South Australian, actually I bloody forgot what seat she's got, Amanda Rishworth. What seat she got these days? She's a member for, that's terrible.
Oh,
that's terrible. I'll have to Google it. Anyway, Amanda Rishworth, an excellent runner. Very, very effective.
Oh, yeah. Look, I think when we find the person who can do it really well and doesn't want to be sitting around, then it becomes a lot better of a job. Look, I've enjoyed everything I've ever done on conference floor because I really like drama. So it's just, the ability to run the Hex's Best motion to the Trots or the Free Ed motion to Student Unity or something like that is so much fun. So, yeah.
That's good. Second last question. What's happening with EdCon this year? Because it's a rite of passage and obviously things are a bit different right now.
Look, I'm really sad about this, but we can't have a physical EdCon. We sort of realised that when the travel ban was put in. So we're doing a Zoom con or an online conference in some respects because there's so much happening in higher education that it would be religion of us to not at least talk in the middle of the year about the state of higher ed and bring out, take out the factional and the bantering and the beef out of EdCon and actually talk about what it's supposed to be there for. So that is going to be online. We're trying to figure that out now. Right now, NatCon should be fine, if anyone's wondering. We're really, fingers crossed.
You heard it here first, folks.
That NatCon happen. Yeah, because I just don't want to... I don't want to miss my swan song of student politics. So I will personally fight the coronavirus if that affects it.
And my last question, and this is the toughest one.
Yeah.
It's June. NUS conference is scheduled for early December. Have you signed your 1-for-1 deal with Student Unity?
Not yet. We have not started. So we have not started thinking about that right now.
Right.
It's been a very busy year.
It's been a very, very busy year. Lock that in. Just do yourself a favour. They're like, what are they like? They must be close to 50% of the floor. You guys will be 35. Just lock it in. Just wrap it up. Just take the floor.
I'll take that to I'll take that to Student Unity.
Very good. Very good.
We'll have to go to court first.
Indeed. Molly, it has been fantastic having you on the show this week. I can't believe that in the 4 years of doing political podcasts that I had never considered inviting the National Union Students President on after all the years I've been involved in student politics. But I've really enjoyed this. This has been great.
Yeah, no, good. If you invite me on next year, I can the unabashed gossip.
Next year.
Caught up by the role.
I'm inviting you on literally the day after NUS conference, and you can tell me exactly what happened, blow by blow. Maybe we could do a socially democratic podcast live from conference floor.
Oh, I think it'd be a bit muffled by yelling, but we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, I could do an up-to-date blow-by-blow account of what's going on the floor. It'd be a fascinating podcast. That would have to start at 3 a.m, no doubt, but it would be a fascinating podcast nonetheless.
Yeah.
Molly, I wish you the best of luck for the rest of this year and strength to your arm and the broader student movement in all of your battles. And thanks very much for your time today.
Yeah, too easy.